Okay, well, let's get on to Republicans, like promised. Okay, so first of all, there's been a lot of crazy polling on QAnon and Republicans in the last couple of weeks, and I want to tell you why you shouldn't necessarily take it for granted. First of all, I'll just tell it to you. PRRI, in particular, the poll which everyone covered, where they put out, they had 3 statements that are associated with QAnon and asked people whether they believed in them as a way of testing, whether they really followed QAnon without using the name QAnon. One was the government, media and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. Yep, that will do it. 15% of Americans agreed with that. 23% of Republicans, 14% of independents, 8% of Democrats. Okay. 20% of Americans agreed with this statement. There is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. Now, my view is that's not specific enough to QAnon. That could just mean anything. That could mean that the Republicans will just take over or whatever. Yeah? But anyway, the numbers are 28% of Republicans agreed with that. 18% of independents agreed with that. 14% of Democrats agreed with that. Yeah, I don't give them credit for that one. And the third statement was, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. 15% of Americans agree with that. 28% of Republicans agree with that. Independents, 13%. Democrats, 7%. Now, that one may or may not be associated with QAnon, but it's not good. So anyway, they're the numbers that people talk about. And there was a few particular aspects of that, like 40% of those who trust One American News Network and Newsmax believe the Satan-worshipping one. 40%. Woo! And interestingly, those who trust Fox News above other sources, only 18% of them believe the Satan-worshipping one. I say only, it's still 18%. But still, it's not 40%. And QAnon, and the satanic belief now polls higher than a lot of major religions. 26% of Hispanic Protestants believe the satanic thing. 25% of white evangelicals believe the satanic thing. I was surprised that the Hispanic Protestants were above the white evangelicals. But anyway, I should have saved that for Dr. Dave. He loves talking about that.
Pentecostal Hispanics is one of his pet topics, I believe.
It is. It certainly is. But anyway, now, I've told you the numbers. I'll tell you why I wouldn't take that quite so seriously. There was another poll from Reuters Ipsos from late March that found 54% of Republicans agreed that the January 6 riots were led by left-wing protesters trying to make Trump look bad. 54%. All right, and you go, well, hang on. 54% of Republicans are saying there's a false flag operation for left-wingers. That is an incredible number. But 51% of Republicans believe that the protesters were mostly peaceful and law-abiding. So you do the maths, and a sizable number of people think that they were left-wing false flags and peaceful and law-abiding. That's a terrible false flag. Now, the truth is that the people who are answering that, and probably a lot of people who answered one or the other, are just indicating what tribe they're a part of. They're not thinking about it, what it means. They're not taking it that seriously. And this is another thing that Dr. Dave loves to go on about, this kind of stuff. Going, yeah, a lot of polls are just signals. They don't actually, you shouldn't necessarily take them seriously as an actual indication of their actual belief. And I think that's a perfect example of that right there. So I just want to raise that because now we're about to talk about the crazies. And let's start with Michael Flynn, who we talked about on the show a bit. I know he's one of your faves. Let's play the clip, and then we'll go from there. Here we go. We've all seen it.
I'm a simple Marine. I want to know why what happened in Myanmar can't happen here.
You know, no reason. I mean, it should happen here. No reason. But that's right.
Dr. Brendon, take it away. Michael Flynn.
Well, issued a denial, but what do those stand for? Those denials that mean nothing. He, I suppose, has traded in all sorts of rumours and stories to be on side with Trump since he campaigned with him in 2016.
And was pardoned by him.
Yeah, and pardoned. He was National Security Advisor, we should remember, for 22 days. Or it would be the shortest tenure, I think, ever, and probably likely into the future.
And still too long.
Yeah. I mean, he was dogged by a story throughout sort of the early Trump administration that he was working for foreign governments without registering himself. He, as like many people who'd been in government, set up a consultancy which offered to lobby on the behalf of foreign governments for various actions. And he was involved with the Turkish government of Erdogan and lobbying to get a cleric in Pennsylvania returned to Turkey to face possibly something pretty ghastly. And there were claims, I remember during the investigations of the first impeachment trial, that that Flynn and his associates were offered $15 billion to kidnap plot for this cleric and put him on a private plane, and send him back to Turkey. So this is a realm of real conspiracy, I suppose, rather than imaginary conspiracy. And to think, he fell a long way from his career in Afghanistan. This was the kinds of people that Donald Trump had around him, with all of these, not just maverick backgrounds, but extraordinary kinds of tendencies. And I suppose that has been one of the reassuring things about Biden. You might not love everyone that's close to him and their ideas, but they are people with, fairly impeccable kind of records of polishing the CV and making sure the blemishes are as minor as possible. And, you look through his national security team for Biden, it's, this collection of Ivy League sort of award winners, who have a particular view about the world and the liberal order and the rest of it. But, they're not people who are, finished way down in their college or went to 4 or 5 different universities to find a home. So they're people who've, who are success stories of the system, where Flynn and some of the others that were associated with Trump are just, they really were often the sort of, the D team. They were, from the sort of far recesses of American life and politics, and somehow got to the center of it.
Yeah, Flynn certainly, he was sacked for a reason. I should say, by the way, with his denial, according to him, when he said, there's no reason, when they ask, is there any reason we can't have the Myanmar style coup, he said, there's no reason. It should be. It should happen.
Yeah, it reminds one of the Putin denial with Trump in Helsinki, doesn't it? It was not the case.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he reckons that when he said, there's no reason, it should happen, what he actually said was, there's no reason it should happen. Which then, as I made the point on the show, even if that was true, which is clearly not true from his intonations, and you can listen to it again, it's clearly not true. Then the audience went, woo, which they wouldn't have done if he just slapped them down. And he said, yeah, that's right.
Stupid idea.
Yeah, like as if he'd say, yeah, that's right. I just shut you down. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense. So, and we should also say that this conference that he was speaking at, the For God and Country Patriot Roundup, its logo was a hat with the initials that stand for "Where we go one, we go all," which is the QAnon phrase, which by the way, I hate that phrase so much, because it's so obviously a cut price, one for all and all for one, right? And like, except for written by someone who speaks English as a second language. It's like this inferior ripoff of a very, very, very well-known phrase, and no one ever calls them out on it. Like, well, you clearly ripped off that phrase. But anyway, so yeah, it was clearly a QAnon conference. The fact their logo was QAnon, and Sidney Powell was there doing it as well, like talking about Trump being reinstated. Do you look? Apparently, according to Maggie Haberman and Charles Cook, Trump genuinely believes that he's going to be reinstated by August. I don't know if we can believe that or not. I don't know what we take from this. I mean, it's like Mike Lindell, who's the My Pillow guy, who, by the way, our editor Schmitty found some very funny overlay, which I'll show you right now. There we go. You can't see it, Dr. Brendon, but they can. He's emerging from the White House looking like he can hear choppers, like at the end of Goodfellas. Just looking really, really shifty. Anyway, he's the My Pillow guy. He sells pillows and infomercials. And he said that to Steve Bannon on his podcast, that if Trump is saying that Trump will be back by August, he reckons that that's why Trump believes it. Anyway, my question to you is, if this is the case, that Trump has surrounded himself with these people who are talking about coups and telling him he's going to be back by August, and he believes it, at what point does he become a non-viable candidate? Is there ever a point?
Yeah, the damaged goods question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question everyone wants to know. Is he viable to run again? You know, is the rebooted Trump in 2024 a possibility?
I mean, I should say, I don't think there is a point. I think he'll never be non-viable.
Yeah.
I
suppose my response to this, I asked this quite a few times, is that it's the fear that Trump holds clearly within the Republican Party, that, people who speak out against him within the party who are elected officials will be primaried, that they'll be attacked by Trump supporters in terms of not just voting, but maybe, physically, verbally, a fear of reprisal is clearly sort of high on the list, that there's a sense that he has a loyal base of not just voters, but people that will scream at you on the internet and maybe worse. So that unfortunately really commands a great deal. And I suppose it raises this bigger question of, is the Trump formula really able to be replicated by other people with a lot of hide and very little shame and, a great deal of confidence? Is it a pretty basic formula that it is heavily based on fear? It's based on appealing to people's fairly kind of, negative instincts, some of the lowest common denominator instincts, or is it unique to Trump? Is Trump, is to use a bit of Latin, sort of sui generis? Is he, because of his celebrity, his brand, his known sort of name status, his connection to reality television and world wrestling, is this something that you can't replicate, that he is a bit of a one of a kind? Well, I kind of swing on both sides. There are Trump-like people elsewhere in the world. So, he's not the first populist, authoritarian, anti-democrat. That's we've got plenty of those around the world, unfortunately. But I think that name recognition he had and his ability, because of being out of the world of celebrity and television, to just say crazy shit and get away with it, I think is probably greater than for politicians. The politicians are at some point possibly going to be held to their record or their statements, where with Trump, that sense that he was never, said to mean much that he said at all, that what he was saying wasn't for sort of any truth claim, it was for positioning. It was, I'm tougher, better, prettier, smarter than all of you, and you're losers and I'm the winner. And that sort of way of seeing his rhetoric, that I think David Roberts was one of the first people to point that out, that you don't take Trump as an explainer of anything. You take what he's saying as a positioning statement, that I'm no more and I'm a winner and you're a loser. And I think that world that I suppose reality television, a certain kind of shock jock approach to politics, I don't know if that can be easily replicated by people who are, the Tom Cottons of this world, who are or Ted Cruz's, who are politicians, whether there's just some kind of flickering, code that they've got to sort of hold to or be held to, that Trump just was never able to be held to. And, in retrospect, when you kind of look back on how he was covered, I think as we get a bit of distance from Trump, you've got to say the media did a pretty miserable job in the United States of covering this guy, that there was this sense constantly of, look what he said now. And I don't know if that was a very effective way of holding him back, certainly. And it was, in some ways, it becomes a pretty tedious way of looking at a politician, to think, he's said this kind of outrageous thing day after day, as though there's not a whole culture that's been outrageous for 20 years, saying all this sort of stuff pretty repetitively.
Yeah, I must say, I did find it tedious. I feel like, when we're talking about the next Trump, the name that I always refer to is DeSantis, who I think is the closest we've got.
Yeah.
I think he does a much better job of aping Trump than Cotton does or Ted Cruz. We'll talk about him in a second. But I do feel, even though to a certain extent DeSantis is following in the mold, and I think he is going to be, if Trump doesn't run, I think he will be the nominee in 2024.
Early call.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy to make early wrong calls, Brendon.
Yeah.
But I do feel that Trump is unique in a bunch of ways, and they're all kind of related in a way. They're all part of the same thing, which is, number one, I don't think anyone is like him in the following characteristics. Number one, he's got genuine charisma. Even when people are horrified by him, they're still fascinated by him. He's got general charisma. He's genuinely entertaining. Like when you actually sit there and watch him, when you see a little quote, you go, oh, I can't believe he said that. When you watch the quote in a 5-minute clip, it's actually entertaining. He actually is. But it's part of his charisma. And it also is exciting because you never know what he's going to do. And he's capable of anything. And it's very rare to have a Republican politician who's exciting. I can't think of a lot. And Trump was the first one. In fact, Trump was the first one I can remember in my lifetime who was genuinely exciting. Obama was exciting when he first turned up. He wasn't so exciting in 2016. But when he first turned up, he was genuinely exciting. And Trump was also genuinely exciting. And I think conservatives have been jealous of the fact that Democrats own Hollywood for a long time. They always promote these C-grade celebrities who are conservative because they go, oh, we got one too. Yeah. Oh, look, Clint Eastwood, he's conservative, honest. Yeah. The Hercules is conservative.
Scott Baio.
Scott Baio's conservative because they're jealous of the fact Democrats have all these charismatic Hollywood types. Now, Trump beats them all in terms of excitement factor. And so I think that was one thing. Another thing is that he even though I think his actual personality is he's scared of everything, he acts like, and he does a very good job of acting like he's not scared of anything. He'll just do anything. And conservatives, I think there's a mindset with conservatives at the moment. They're feeling bullied by the world. They feel like they are being victimized by the world a little bit at the moment. Like they feel like the whole culture's turned against them, which I think it has, to be honest. I think they're right. The culture has turned against them. And I think that the fact there was this guy who just didn't care, who seemed like he just didn't care and just would take anything. I think that was very attractive to them. And I think that's something politicians cannot copy. Politicians are Ted Cruz is clearly scared of certain things. Like Trump never had that sense, even though I think deep down he's actually extremely insecure. He's disruptive in a way that no other politician would ever be. Like he just does stupid shit. DeSantis doesn't do stupid shit. Whereas Trump did constant stupid shit. And most importantly, I think he always came off as just like them. He came off as a guy who was genuinely happy just sitting at home watching Fox News and eating burgers. And we don't have politicians like that normally. And I think you combine that all, and I can see why conservatives loved him so much and why no one who copies his moves is going to be anything like him. Now, that doesn't mean that DeSantis can't win an election campaign, but I think the lightning in the bottle of Trump, I think that stuff I just said is the reason for it. I just don't think that can be copied myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot to that. And in the way that he dominated the global media, we get, I think, a sense of how much this guy either drew people towards him or repelled people. You know, he was, as you say, this kind of lightning rod character that, you know, bless your show that it's going on and on without Trump, and that people are still, you know, what I teach, interested in American politics and American society. But, you know, there was this fever pitch of interest that you did get in that Obama campaign of 2008 and for a bit of the time into his presidency, that American politics was show business, it was life, it was entertainment as well as it was serious. And with Trump, you know, that mixture, that cocktail of, as you say, entertainment and sometimes politics, you know, and scary stuff that this guy might, you know, ban various groups or stop people from coming, or, you know, say things early on to the North Koreans that could get totally out of hand, or, you know, ring up Taiwan without knowing it and say, you know, just here for a chat, you know, without protocols or whatever they were. But, you know, I suppose one of the questions is that if someone follows some of the formula, but is more organised? Are they potentially more dangerous than Trump? You know, that sure, there are significant things we might talk about immigration that Trump did, cutting the refugee numbers dramatically. But, you know, there are a lot of things that he mouthed off about that he didn't do. Yeah,
that's true. That's true. I'm going to just do a couple of very quick Trump angles here, which will surprise, I think, most people. I don't know if it'll surprise you, but it'll surprise most people at home because none of them have gotten press. Like, as soon as we've sort of moved on, people just drop the threads they were holding so tightly before. Like, for instance, did you know that Don McGahn is now testifying against Trump right now? Did you know that? like for those who don't know what I'm talking about, during the Mueller inquiry, there was this obsession with Don McGahn, who was his first chief of staff, who basically Trump tried to conspire with to obstruct justice. He's the one who Trump instructed to do all kinds of dodgy stuff with Comey and Mueller and try and get rid of the Mueller investigation and all the rest of it. And at the time, and there was lots of juicy stuff of him in the Mueller report, and the Congress wanted him to testify to try and get more out of him, and Trump just said, no, I'm not giving him permission. That's executive privilege. Yeah. And Don McGahn said, well, I'm not going to testify if I not give him permission to. And so they went to court, and they went to court, and they went to court, and they were still in court when Biden took over, and now guess who's in control of executive privilege? It's Biden. And he said, you know what? I renounce our executive privilege. You can testify. Yeah. So he's testifying right now to Congress in secret. It's not in front of cameras. Yeah. It's going to leak. Don't you worry. Yeah. And I don't know where it's going to go. I don't think it's going to end up with Trump in chains, but I think it's going to be pretty interesting at the very least. That's one thing that isn't getting much coverage. Yeah. Another thing, do you remember we used to go on a lot about Trump's taxes? Do you remember that? Yeah. And we were all very upset about the fact that Trump's taxes weren't being publicized. They weren't being given to Congress, even though we were assured that the law says if Congress asks for someone's taxes, they get them. And it went to court and went to court and went to court and so on. Once again, we're in a situation now where Biden's Department of Justice is in control of whether Congress get Trump's taxes. Now, we know the New York Attorney General's got Trump's taxes, but they're secret. Yeah. If Congress gets it, they'll be public. Justice officials tell CNN that the department's leaders have tried to cast the current administration as restoring normalcy after 4 years of Trump interfering in the nation's top law enforcement agency. Part of the effort, the officials say, is refraining from using the department to relitigate controversies from the previous administration. They've said no. The Biden Department of Justice have said no to Trump's taxes being released. Would you have predicted that 12 months ago, 24 months ago? Maybe you would have predicted it if you're cynical. But we've come a long way. And it's got no coverage at all. Another one. The Federal Election Commission this week fined the National Enquirer's parent company $187,000 for knowingly and willfully violating election law by making a catch-and-kill payment to Karen McDougal. She was a woman who had sex with Donald Trump, wanted to go to, Donald Trump cheated on his wife. She wanted to go to the tabloids. They paid her, and then they didn't run her story. The FEC says that's an obvious violation of an in-kind contribution to Donald Trump's campaign. Should have been declared. Yeah. They fined him $187,000. How about Trump?
Came out during the Stormy Daniels kind of moment, didn't it? That this was the National Enquirer, which usually loves a good scandal, was suddenly mopping up scandals and saying these scandals aren't, fit for these scandals that might have happened as opposed to Elvis in the Jungle. Yeah. We're not going to print them.
Yeah. Well, and the FEC this week suing them fined them for it. They said to fine Trump over the same thing because why don't they fine Trump? He was part of it. To fine Trump over the same thing, the FEC would have to find that Trump knew of the in-kind contribution, failed to report it, if not actively sought it. Now, that's all obviously true, but they say they can't prove it. So he gets away with it. One more. Sondland. Remember Gordon Sondland? He was testifying against Trump in the Ukraine impeachment.
Ambassador to Europe, wasn't he?
That's right.
EU?
Exactly. Yeah. He's currently suing Pompeo because Pompeo promised to pay his legal fees and then he changed his mind when Sondland turned against them in his testimony. Yeah. Now, you might go, who cares? Well, he was given $86,000, right? And apparently that wasn't nearly enough. So you can imagine how high his legal fees were just for testifying at an impeachment hearing. It's not like they were special. So presumably everyone had similar kinds of legal fees. If you have a situation where the administration holds that over your head, that literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of payments are depending on whether you testify the way they want you to, we're screwed.
Yeah.
You're not going to get any kind of insight or oversight in if that's the case. And it appears that there's nothing illegal for them to do that, that they just got away with it. And anyway, he's trying to sue them. We'll see if they do get away with it. But at least so far, if the administration can blackmail you with your testimony, which is a shocker.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's some random Trump stuff. I'm going to skip past Arizona audit for a number of reasons. I'm looking my eye on the clock. Let's go to DeSantis quickly because I just want to just mention something about him, which was that he just passed 2 laws to try and go for the vacant position so far of being the next Trump. Yeah. One was a law prohibiting social media sites from blocking political candidates unless the owner of the site also happens to operate a theme park in Florida because they want to exclude Disney because Disney's a big contributor to Florida, the Floridian economy. But this whole prohibiting social media sites from blocking people is obviously a violation of the First Amendment, especially when you exclude Disney. But then in the same week, he also passed a law saying that no businesses are allowed to ask if you're vaccinated, even ask. Now, schools have done that for decades. Yeah. But apparently businesses can't do that. And it's been kind of funny because cruisers are meant to check vaccines by the CDC, according to CDC. And he said, you're not allowed to do that. Cruisers are a very big part of the Floridian economy.
Yeah.
Cruisers, if they want to exclude Florida, can just go from the Caribbean, which is right next door.
Yeah.
So some cruisers have said, well, we're just going to boycott Florida. And others have said, we'll see you in court.
Yeah.
So if you're DeSantis, you can just back down, right? No, you can't because he's trying to replace Trump. So you got to fight. Right? So this is what he's come up with. As soon as you pass through, this is not official yet. This is what the people off the record have been saying from his administration. As soon as you pass through and step on the ship, you're no longer considered to be local. You're now in international waters. So DeSantis can still say that people in Florida will not have to show vaccination proof to go to bars and restaurants and Walmart and Target, but cruising is now different. Now, obviously that's legal garbage, but that's how you run for president. That's where we're at.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Well, he's painted himself as a champion of the cruise industry, that these are his core voters, that these are his people. So, I mean, if there was ever a place that you needed a passport to get, a vaccination passport to get on a cruise would be a good idea with the famous ventilation systems and the issues that we had here in Sydney with the cruise boats.
80% of passengers say they want vaccinations checked.
Yeah, so there's a reasonableness to this, to their request. But, whether this will be one of these kind of mad civil liberties and anti sort of vax combinations is going to be really fascinating to watch because there clearly will be holdouts on the vaccination. The rates are pretty impressive in the United States, but there will be a holdout population. And how much do we have to suffer if we travel because of that holdout population, and what kind of rights do that holdout population have? Well, that's a big political issue ahead of us, isn't it? That's a storm on the horizon. And so this is the first kind of one of the first examples of this, and we'll hear a lot more about this in politics. And the Republicans, do you think that they can get kind of wedged on this? I mean, is this an issue where, as you say, they're going to want to stand up for sort of privacy and some of the anti-vax kind of arguments, but there is going to be a majority that are vaccinated and not going to be too happy with their minority friends and fellow members of their state or city who don't get vaccinated.
Potentially, but I think that this is such a small period of time between the period where enough people are vaccinated to be an interest group of their own, and we don't have so many people vaccinated that COVID's no longer an issue. Like I feel like this is a window of about a month or 2 months where this is an issue, but in 2 months' time, there'll be enough people vaccinated that will get to herd immunity, and so no one's going to care anymore. Like the heat will just go out of it. That's what I think, at least. I think by the end of July, the heat's gone out of this issue. But for this little period, it's a little bit interesting. Woo, about to fall off here. Do you have anything to say about Texas? Otherwise, because I've talked about this to death on the show, but if you have anything to say, you can jump in now while I get a new chair.
Yeah, it snapped, has it? I'm glad you didn't fall. Voting suppression in Texas, I suppose a lot of people rightly appalled by this. Democrats, have left the Texas legislature, which I remember going to in Austin years ago, and you can walk on the floor of the Texas legislature as members of the Texas public or maybe even just visitors and deliver checks during debates. That's not illegal in Texas.
That's
and
the Tom DeLay tactic.
It's a huge area, sort of tables, and resembles a school fete more than a legislative chamber. And, these laws, which probably should have led to the Democrats fleeing to Oklahoma as they've done before on gerrymandering, appalling in many regards. So just to spend a bit of time today looking into them, no drive-through voting, they're very obviously sort of targeted at poorer, at African-American voters, at Hispanic voters. One of the interesting things, I think, about what we're talking about before about African-American female voting is I think they're a group who've sort of recognised the Republican Party doesn't want us to vote. The Republican Party isn't interested in us in terms of legislation, but it doesn't even want us to come to the polls. And that for a generation might be, something that bonds them very firmly in the Democratic Party's camp or for longer. Whether that becomes something, with Hispanics, I think will be really interesting to follow, that if the Democrats can make the argument that people like you are not being encouraged or being actively discouraged from voting, is there a consequence to this kind of legislation, which is, that you're consigning whole groups of people to be strongly aligned with the Democratic Party? And so I think the Democrats have got to use this as well as oppose it as a political tactic for support, because it's so clearly targeted.
I must say I've always been of the view, and from what I read, the Biden administration seems to be of the same view, that the suppressive nature of these kinds of rules would undoubtedly stop X number of people from voting, but it would motivate a much larger number than X to also vote. And I think that at least in the short term, maybe not in the long term, but in the short term, I think it actually works against you as much as anything. At the very least, it's a wash. Certainly, I've seen plenty of studies suggesting that the last 20 years of voter fraud obsession from the Republicans has only led to higher participation rates from Democrats, especially in the places where they're most obsessed with it. So I don't think it necessarily, at least in the short term, rebounds to their advantage. And I believe that's what the Biden administration thinks as well, that they're more concerned about the changing the regulations for who's in control rather than for the Tiki Touchwood hours for early voting and stuff like that type stuff. Like, you can always work around that stuff. You can't work around the person who's the boss of whether it's a legitimate election.
I suppose one of the things that really kind of annoys me as a thought and maybe as a reality in the future are these partisan poll watchers. That someone who's very fond of the Australian Electoral Commission and he's kind of the neutrality of elections. The thought of people turning up, your sort of Brooks Brothers riots of 2000 and the 2000 in Florida, of turning up there and telling people who they see as potential illegal immigrants or people who, they're going to claim are ex-felons or whatever on some kind of racially profiling basis, that they have to produce ID during a long wait in an election line. That seems ripe for those who are going to suggest that the United States is not a democracy to be portraying on television. RT is going to have a field day with that kind of thing. And those who see American democracy as a bit of a sham, that would feed into it It undermines the system in so many ways and would lead, will lead to all sorts of these ludicrous arguments that we saw at the end of last year about poll watchers and monitors in the voting process having some legitimacy, even if they're standing, half a mile away from the counter with their binoculars.
I do agree with that. Yeah. I think I've had this conversation with Dave before. I do feel like the real problem in the long run, when we look back on this period in 15, 20 years' time, I feel like we're going to say the biggest issue was, I hate using the term both sides because it's never both sides equally, but I see this on both sides, a drive to delegitimize certain people's conduct of the election, and they're both trying to delegitimize different people. But it's left, this whole period is leaving us with no one trusting elections. And I think that once that trust is gone, it's gone. And I'm worried that in 10 years or 15 years' time or maybe even 2 years or 4 years' time, there's going to be just a critical mass of people who just don't believe the result.
Yeah.
And that's going to suck.
I spent a bit of time, just for some unknown reason over the last few days, looking at the career of Robert Kennedy Jr. And in 2004, Robert Kennedy Jr., the son of RFK, the brother of John F. Kennedy, was going about spouting all this stuff about Bush's election in 2004 being a fraud, that the exit polls didn't sort of align with the votes, that there was, machines that were tampered with. There was, I suppose, a kind of a sense, because of the Florida events, which are probably illegitimate in some regards, if probably the intentions of voters had been counted, their Gore probably would have won. So there was reason to be, very annoyed, but that carried over into 2004 on the left of the Democratic Party, or I don't know if you could call it the left, with kind of, anti-vaxxers like Robert Kennedy Jr., in some kind of fantasy realm where they didn't really look at the evidence. And I suppose it's that movement away from the facts that really, I think, in the details, that gets at the point you're making, that the democratic process, that the information process that democracies rely on will be possibly something we look back on and say, yeah, that liberal democracy thing was a little better than we gave it credit for. Yeah. And that's a big concern, I think, for many of us.
Yeah, because I think what people forget is democracy requires consent. It requires the person who loses to consent. As soon as you lose that consent, then it's game on. Like anyone's capable of anything if there's no longer consent by the loser. Yeah. And they're going, and if they don't believe it, they're going to not going to consent. Anyway, I'm definitely got my eye on the clock now, because normally with Dave, it's just that he has to get out at a certain time. I don't think you're in a rush to get out, are you?
No, not particularly.
No, okay, but I am conscious of not having a 12-hour podcast.
Yeah.
So what we got a bunch to talk about here, but what I want to do is, I've been putting off immigration for a while. You got a bit to say about that as well, so that's good. So let's do immigration now. After that, let's see how we're going. I'm happy after that for you to finish off with anything you want to talk about. We're going to talk about COVID stuff. We're going to talk about lab leaks. We're going to talk about all kinds of stuff. I'm happy for you to take any topic at all that you want to talk about, or we can just keep on going forever. It's really up to you. I won't stop you, but let's just get immigration. Now, I'm going to normally I like to have conversations. I'm going to rattle through a bit just so it doesn't go quite so quick, so slow. But you jump in whenever you want, okay? But I'm going to be slightly more reedy than I normally am, just to keep it a little bit shorter. But I will throw to you a number of times. But on top of that, please jump in anytime, okay? And I apologise for the viewers that I'm going to be a little bit more reedy of notes during this. Okay, so. Immigration. All right. First of all, polling-wise, this has been a bit of a sore point for Biden. I'm not going to go through the polls. I'm going to try and save some time. But it's interesting that I'll just mention a few I find interesting. Pew, 69% of those polled said, this is a recent poll, said there should be a way for undocumented immigrants living here to stay in the country legally if they fulfill certain requirements. 69%. Okay, that's a big number. But 79% of people polled by Pew say that it's either very or somewhat important to reduce the number of people seeking asylum in the US. And I know we're going to talk about that in a second. A full half of people say it's somewhat or very important for the US to disallow asylum seekers entirely. 50%. So that's 0 asylum seekers. So what they're doing is they're distinguishing between asylum seekers and other kinds of immigrants there, right? And this is something I find in polls over and over again. I'm sure you know more about than I do. The Americans, for reasons I don't entirely understand, are generally a lot cooler with immigrants, even illegal immigrants, than they are with asylum seekers and refugees. Even though you would think it would be the opposite, because refugees, you get to pick. Whereas illegal immigrants and immigrants, you don't get to pick them so much. Like the refugees, these are people who spent 20 years trying to get to a country, and they will do anything to get to that country. And they're usually really hard workers and really grateful, and all the things that people want from immigrants. That's what they are, but they get treated like shit all the time. And I don't understand that attitude. But anyway, even Democrats are moving against immigration at the moment, illegal immigration. According to 538, Democrats who say it's important to reduce the numbers of asylum seekers on the border have gone from 61% in August 2019 to 68% now. Okay, so that's where the polling's at. So let's just talk about the numbers briefly, and then I'll let you jump in a little bit, and then I'll talk about some details. Border interceptions for April were up to 178,000. That's the most encounters in a single month since April of 2000, when 182,000 were apprehended. Recently, there's an average of about 1,500 what they call gotaways per day. So you can add basically 45,000 on top of that. They're people who get through the system into the country without anyone catching them. They know they're there because they see them on the cameras, but they don't get to them before they're gone. Right?
And that's per day?
That's per day, 1,500 per day. Yeah. CBP, Customs and Border Protection agents, have seized 6,494 pounds of fentanyl at the southern border in the first 4 months of 2021. There was 4,700 pounds in the whole of last year. So they're already blowing that up to April. Unaccompanied minors, they dropped 9.4% to 17,000 in April from 18,000 in March. But that is still well above the previous high of 11,000. That was in May 2019. Where all those border crosses were from were actually from single adults. 111,000 single adults were stopped by CBP in April, up from 100,000 in March. By contrast, the number of unaccompanied minors apprehended by authorities dropped. Right, and nearly 90% of those 111,000 who were stopped by customs were immediately deported because of Title 42, which I'm about to talk about after I let you jump in, which is actually I'll let you jump in right now.
I suppose what I've followed in recent years is the refugee intake.
So
this group that you're saying is the ones that wait for the process, and that we've in some ways in Australian debates valorised as the as the genuine refugees and the people who deserve to come to Australia. And we've taken in Australia roughly around 20,000 sort of for quite a long period of time for an increase. In the early 80s there was a bit more when we took quite a lot from Vietnam and whatnot. But in the United States, the numbers under Trump went down really dramatically, and it was one of those good examples where people would say, well, Trump is all hot air, he's a blowhard, and a lot of this doesn't translate. On the immigration front, and particularly on refugees, it did translate. It went down from around 70,000 in Obama's last year to the end of the Trump administration, just down to 12,000. So America taking less official refugees than Australia, obviously a much smaller country. Biden has set a target for this year of 65,000. So that is an immediate turnaround.
If they get there.
Yeah. I mean, a tough time to get people in and out of your country with COVID. But, that record of being, the biggest taker of refugees, which, during the Clinton period, I think it got up to about 150,000 refugees America was taking a year, is something that I think Biden would be part of as kind of, America showing global leadership.
I might be wrong about this. This is my memory. I don't have a stat in front of me. This is my memory from like 5 years ago. But I'm pretty sure until recently, if Houston was a country, it would have been, I think, the 4th biggest taker of refugees in the world. Just Houston alone. America was taking such a large proportion of the world's refugees. Yeah. And it's and now they've just completely just lost it.
For the fiction readers out there, I discovered an American writer, African-American writer over the summer called Brian Washington, absolutely gifted talent. And he's got a collection of short stories called Lot, which is all refugee tales. They're all living in apartment blocks that are leaky, hot, uncomfortable, but have interesting food stalls out the front of them. And it's all Caribbean, Latin American refugees in these apartments. And the stories are kind of fly-on-the-wall stuff, you know, the gossip, and the whatnot. So for those of you who, like myself, enjoy the escaping from the world of reality into the world of fiction, that Brian Washington is just a terrific writer. He's got a novel out, but the short stories, I think, are the real winners. The New Yorker, he's done a bit of stuff for the New Yorker as well recently.
So if you look at the polling on Biden's policies, like some of these polling companies poll each individual policy, each individual executive action. Back at the beginning of his administration, he had an executive action to go straight back to the Obama targets for refugees, and then he broke it, and then he started to meander his way back to it. But when he first did it, that was the only executive action that he passed that had underwater approval for Americans. Like every other one, and I hated some of these executive actions personally, but every other one was either had majority support and sometimes huge majority support. That one, it was like, I don't remember the number off the top of my head. It was like something like 35% approval or something like that, something terrible. Once again, why do you think Americans hate refugees so much at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's been a priming of this kind of view among some Americans that refugees are all coming from, you know, what was Trump's horrendous kind of way of describing Africa. You know, these shithole countries was his statements, are all coming from, you know, countries which are majority Muslim countries. So there's been a depiction that refugees come from, you know, the Middle East, Afghanistan, northern Africa, which is, you know, not, of course, the whole story. A lot of them are coming from Latin America. But the stat that you're giving me, that those who have crossed in some ways illegally are more welcome than those who've come and waited for the UNHCR process. I mean, that is mind-blowing, and that disturbs me, and I don't fully understand it apart from the fact that, you know, there are, I suppose, some Americans who have a lot more to do with refugees who've come illegally rather than legally. But I mean, the legal ones historically that came to the United States were Iranians that supported the Shah. You know, they were South Vietnamese that supported the sort of, you know, the anti-communist governments. They were, you know, Nicaraguans who were on the side of the Contras. You know, these were people who were drawn to the Republican Party and were not, you know, not going to be staunchly anti-American. They came for political reasons. So that story is clearly lost as well, or that heritage.
Yeah, and Cubans as well.
Yeah.
I was going to say that, look, I don't know if this is, I'm just in my own head trying to answer my own question. The best I can come up with off the top of my head, and I have no evidence for this because, as you can see, I was frantically searching some numbers, but I couldn't find any in time, was that back in 2014, I remember there was a lot of poisoning of the well with refugees, about the Syrian refugees at the time, and Trump was part of this, even though he wasn't at that point in time running. As a popular tweeter, he was going on and on about Syrian refugees being terrorists. And even the children, they're like,
I remember that. And just ridiculous at the time.
I'm sure that didn't help, but I don't know if that's solely to blame. But something happened between the 80s and now when refugees were genuinely popular in the 80s. And there's never been, it's not like terrorism has been associated with refugees. It just hasn't.
No.
it's
total furphy.
You know. It's like, even when people talk about, you know, people on the terror watch list crossing the border, and there's a few of them, they're not refugees, as you say. Like,
they're not waiting in the camp.
No, they're not. It'd be a very inefficient way to be a terrorist, to sit around for 15 years in a refugee camp before you end up in the country. But anyway, I'll keep on going, and then then I'll come back to you there, unless you got more to say about refugees. No. Okay, all right. Let's talk about Title 42, because this is going to be, I think, the battleground in the next few weeks or few months. Okay, because I said nearly 90% of the adults were deported because of Title 42. Title 42 is a health regulation that says while COVID is going on, You just don't let people in at all. Just bounce them immediately. Doesn't matter if they're worthy. Doesn't matter if they have a legitimate claim. Doesn't matter if they're Jesus Christ himself. You bounce them as soon as they hit the border because of COVID reasons, right? And Trump instituted that. Well, it was already there, but Trump took advantage of it for the border. He declared the border to be an issue of Title 42 significance. And for that reason, they had remember the Remain-in-Mexico program where they sent people to Mexico to wait for their turn. Those people, just their turn went forever. They just didn't take any more because of Title 42. They said, if you're in Mexico, you don't come over. That's it. But the thing is, it wasn't for everyone. It was just for the people they wanted it to be. Because they're still, right now, the Biden administration is taking kids because Mexico won't take them. So they're bouncing the adults, but they're taking the kids and they're taking the families with kids. And you got to remember that whenever you hear people go, open borders, remember 111,000 people bounced last month. That's not open borders, right? Okay. Anyway, there's still vaccine tourism going on, like a lot of it. Like in April, was it April? It's 2 weeks in May. They took 120,000 travel packages from Mexicans looking for vaccinations. Wow. So much for Title 42 there. 120,000 in 2 weeks. And there's still there were 106 million people who crossed the border in 2020. Title 42 didn't affect them. Mind you, there was less than there were. It was 188 million people the year before. But still, 106 million people, that's a pretty leaky border. Just not the asylum seekers, right? And not the people they want to keep out, right? So Title 42 has been used very selectively. Okay, but that's Title 42. But let's talk about the immigrants. Since the policy was enacted, Title 42, CBP has conducted more than 730,000 expulsions at the southern border, during this COVID period. Most of them were single adults, like I said. Most of them were single adults who've been expelled before. So these are repeat offenders. There's about 730,000.
Recidivists.
Yeah. 350,000 people this year have been expelled before. Between March 2020 and February 2021, CBP estimates that 38% of all apprehensions involving migrants had crossed at least once before. Okay. Compared to recidivism rates between 7 and 14% in previous years. Now, this is where we get to the policy aspect of this. Because the academics say this does not work. The Title 42 type stuff doesn't work. You think it works because it seems like it works just to bounce them. But studies suggest that hardcore enforcement does not discourage migration. What it does is it makes people feel like you're unfair. So when they get over, because they keep on trying, as we've discovered, they keep on trying. When they get over, they don't cooperate with your laws because they think you're unfair. If they think that you're going to give them a fair go, they will cooperate with your laws. If they don't, they just go into hiding immediately, like they can so easily in America. And there's some numbers to prove this. The number of encounters at the border fell by half in fiscal year 2020 compared to the previous year. But the numbers of encounters that required a rescue operation doubled to the highest rate in at least a decade. The death rate also nearly doubled during the same period, from 35 to 62 migrants found dead for every 100,000 migrants encountered. And there was a lot more migrants encountered, right, during this period just now. Why is that? It's because when you're going hardcore enforcement, they cross in more dangerous regions. They don't stop trying. They just go to more dangerous regions. They become more reliant on the services of people smugglers, which means they pay more, which means it becomes a more lucrative industry, which means the people smugglers become more powerful. And this is the process that we've been in. And they stay here when they come. Between 1980 and 2010, the probability a migrant would return after their first trip to the US dropped from 48% to 0. Because they used to go back half the time. They used to go back after they came to America. But now as enforcement got harder and harder and harder, they just stay. So, yes, I'm not saying that hardcore enforcement does nothing. Obviously it does something. I'm just saying it's not as effective as you might think. Like a simple mind would go, oh, that's it. Problem solved. Not necessarily. Okay. So Biden has a question about what he's going to do with Title 42 because COVID is coming to an end. It's not there yet. especially not in Mexico.
Yeah.
But, over the next few months, over the next year or so, he's going to have a decision to make, because also this annoys people on the border who have to deal with Title 42 with themselves. Even though, as I said, they do let a lot of people over. They don't let everyone over. A May memo reviewed by the Washington Free Beacon, authored by senior staff at CBP, suggested that the Biden administration is looking to more liberally interpret Title 42, broadening humanitarian exemption. That obviously could make a very big difference. So we'll see what happens there. Do you have any thoughts about Title 42 or anything?
No, I'll let you go on that.
Okay, all right, okay, no worries.
Good summary.
The second issue is kids in cages, which we've talked about ad nauseum. Now, HHS has, we recall 2 months ago, it was a critical situation where there were way more in basically detention than there were under Trump, and the conditions were just as bad, if not worse. Right? Yeah. Since then, HHS has diverted more than $2 billion meant for other health initiatives towards covering the cost of caring for unaccompanied immigrant children. They've increased their positions from about 11,000 to about 21,000, and they're almost full again, so they're going to keep on going. But you have a situation now where they're not in these detention centres. They're in proper health centres, but they're temporary centres. And so the question is, how good are these temporary health centres that are just erected out of nowhere? Turns out they don't let a lot of people talk who go and visit these. You'll notice there isn't much footage, basically none, except for what's leaked out, the odd photo. Certainly there's no press there. I don't think that's a coincidence. Leanne Welsh told the New York Times in a recent piece, she's a child advocate lawyer, that she got to go to Fort Bliss, which is one of them. And she says, quote, "It's much worse in every respect than the Trump facility that everyone in Tornillo in 2019, which people were bagging out." A trainer there said to Reason magazine, "I've been into one dorm one time and I was like, yeah, I'm not going back there. They're filthy, they're dirty, there's food on the floor, there's wet spots all over the place, the beds are dirty. Some of the incidents complaints we're getting also is that we've got minors who are requesting medical due to not feeling well, and staff members are telling them there's nothing wrong with you, go back to your bed," the trainer says. Many of the boys and girls have not been given underwear, particularly ones who've been in COVID isolation, a federal employee says. After they come out, they're issued new clothes but no underwear. And very often it's only one set of clothes. So no clothes are changed into, no underwear. When we've asked about it, and I personally escorted some kids to tents to ask how come they can't get underwear, the answer is, well, the contractor is supposed to provide that. I don't think there's anyone out there trying to be cruel, trying to stop kids having underwear. But when you expand something very, very rapidly with the bureaucracy, things screw up. And I think that's what we're seeing there, especially when you're spending huge amounts of money really rapidly to try and build all these centres out of nowhere. Welsh interviewed 16 girls in another centre who stayed there, and she told CBS News that they reported being constantly hungry and thirsty, being served undercooked chicken and expired food, and having limited access to showers and laundry. Some said they had only showered twice in 15 days. There were no educational activities, no access to the outdoors, and nothing to do during the day. That centre was closed down soon after. Okay, so I've done a bit of reading there, but this is something that you're not reading much about because there's no press coverage because the press aren't allowed there. And what's not helping? This is really not helping. Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, has been a massive prick about this. He's been complaining about these centres being not good for kids. At the same time, he's saying he'll revoke the licenses of Texas businesses that house or place undocumented minors as part of their contracts with the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement. Because he's just going to war with Biden about this. He wants, I was about to swear, he wants to remain in Mexico and Title 42 and all that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. Obviously, that's going to make it harder to find places to place these kids, right? And anyway, and he's also says he's declared Texas as a disaster zone, and he's going to declare, and he said from next week he's going to start arresting border crossers wherever he finds them, which is really going to help. That will obviously send them further underground, and okay. Anyway, do you have anything to say about any of that?
Well, I suppose it's the American underbelly, isn't it? I mean, this treatment of people on the border was rightly a huge international issue during the Trump administration, and it needs to continue to be a huge international issue because how America treats children, at its border is in some ways a sign of its values. And if it was a sign of its values under Donald Trump, it's got to be a sign of its values under Joe Biden. So I think it needs, scrutiny, good on you for getting in the deep dive here. I think it is the kind of thing that isn't, that can be sort of brushed aside with some of the sort of positive stories about the Biden administration that you do see in, the media I tend to read.
I want to emphasize, I'm not thinking that anyone's doing this on purpose. I don't think there's any sadism happening here. Yeah. I think people are doing their best, but the results are not good enough. Yeah. Except for Greg Abbott. I'm not happy with him. Yeah. Anyway, meanwhile, while all that's happening, the people who are coming are changing. And this is another thing that doesn't get said much. 30% of all families encountered along the border in April came from countries that weren't Mexico or Central America, compared to 7.5% in April 2019 during the last border surge. It used to be first it was all Mexico back in the 90s and noughts. Then it was all Central America under Obama. Now we've got a bunch of Ecuadorians. There were 12,500 Ecuadorians in March. There were 4,000 Brazilians in March. There were 3,500 Venezuelans in March. There's people from Europe and Asia that are coming across. They intercepted people in March from 160 countries along the southern border. Now, some of them are COVID tourists. Yeah. People who are trying to just get away from COVID places. Yeah. Some of them are not. Yeah. And you got a problem there because I don't want to use the rhetoric of the restrictionists, from Australia, but they aren't real asylum seekers. People who are coming from 160 countries flying to Mexico and then walking to the southern border from there. That's bullshit. I don't know what you do about that. No. It's okay. So anyway, so there's that. The alternative now. Okay, so now it's what Biden's doing about this kind of stuff. Okay, they've changed the alternative methods of detention. Yep. They used to have ankle bracelets where they'd stick people in these ankle bracelets. Now they're expediting the process because, hey, okay. Do you know how long? Take a guess how long the queue is at the moment for asylum seeking. No idea. 940 days. Yeah. That's how long you've got to wait before your time in court. 940, almost 3 years. Mm-hmm. They're talking about expediting the process to less than 300 days. Woo! This express. They're like rug burns from the speed at which they've been processed. Okay, so that's what they're going to try and do. They're not going to use ankle bracelets anymore. Too expensive. They're going to use an app in your phone. They give them these guys phones if they don't already have them. The app has facial recognition software to confirm that you are and that you are who you say you are, and the GPS coordinates, obviously. I don't know if you can get around that or not. It's good. It's worth a try, I guess. 100,000 illegal immigrants are already part of this program as of May 13. So we'll see how that goes. And then they tell them, we'll get back to you. So, deporting conditions have completely changed. Under Biden's new rules, deportation officers must seek written authorization from senior level supervisors to arrest anyone who's not a recent border crosser, a national security threat, or an aggravated felon who poses a public safety hazard. And so as a result of that, ICE deportations have fallen to all-time lows. Last month, they deported 2,962 illegal immigrants. That's with 6,000 agents. So the agents, they're not happy. They're doing a lot of whinging. Republicans aren't very happy about that either. They want more deportations. Republicans are also not happy about Biden formally ending remaining in Mexico this week. So now the people who arrived before Biden, they either need to go home or they need to reapply. Now, my view on remain in Mexico, this is probably an unpopular one for someone who's into immigration like I am. I actually think in theory, I didn't have a massive problem with it. In theory, I emphasize, in that I understand the logic of saying when someone's in America, they stay there for 942 days before you hear their case. They're as good as there afterwards. And if they don't have a legitimate case, what are you going to do? Send someone back who's been there for 3 years? They're part of the country at that point in time. So I understand the logic of saying, you know what? If you want to be an asylum seeker, you go into this halfway house. If it is a proper halfway house, and we'll get to you real soon, like in 30 days, real soon. We'll find out if you have a proper case. If you don't, you're going home. If not, you're coming. If you do, you're coming in. I understand that logic. That to me, I can understand that. But for that to happen, you have to have a timely hearing
Yep.
not 942 days. And secondly, and not stay there forever like they were during Title 42, during COVID. And secondly, you can't just leave them in slums. You need to give them a proper place to stay. You need to give them a job. You need to let them allowed to live like a human being. Otherwise, it's just torturing them, right?
Yep.
And Human Rights First documented more than 490 instances of violent attacks and kidnappings targeting asylum seekers who were expelled to Mexico just in the Title 42 period last year. So they never did remain in Mexico, right? They completely screwed it up, and now they're complaining that's ended. But anyway, one more thing that Biden's doing that I really like, and then we're going to talk about the root causes of South America. I'm sorry I'm going so deep, but it's just no one else does this. Biden's finally reassigned the wall funding, which was, if you recall, 2 years ago, Trump declared state of emergency.
Yep.
And said, such an emergency, we're taking all the stuff from the military to build the wall. Biden's just done the opposite. And now Republicans are trying to sue him to make him spend money on the wall that Trump inappropriately took from the Defense Department. Yeah. Quote, each day this impoundment continues. Funds lawfully appropriated for border wall construction are cynically under-executed and the reserve is growing. I find that really funny because obviously the whole thing was so inappropriate that he was taking this money from defense projects. But anyway. Okay, so let's talk about what Biden's actually trying to do. There's two things he's trying to do. No, sorry, do you want to jump in at this point, Tom?
No, I'm good.
Okay, two things he wants to do. First of all, deal with the root causes. Now, this is the Kamala Harris thing.
Yeah.
Where people were when he declared Kamala Harris as like the border czar, what he was saying was she'd be in charge. I've got the quote here. This is what they said at the time. This is not hindsight. To tackle the migration challenge at the U.S. southern border and work with Central American nations to address root causes of the problem. That's what he said back in March 24 when he assigned Kamala Harris, right? Since then, everyone's been going, the conservatives have been going, where's Kamala? Why isn't she at the border? Why isn't she doing anything about the border crossings? Now, obviously, they're trying to ding her up for 2024. It's so depressing. But, okay, she has been negotiating with Central America during this period, okay? And they've been dealing with the roots. And the root causes what are the root causes? Well, you've got a situation where in Guatemala, sorry, hang on. In Guatemala, in the indigenous areas of Guatemala in the north, there's a high level of deep poverty and very high levels of food insecurity. They're living on less than $2 a day, essentially. So it's poverty in Guatemala. In Honduras, they've just had a whole bunch of hurricanes, which has just destroyed their entire urban environment. Okay?
Huge crime rate as well.
Yes, that's right. Okay. So you got people living in tin shacks that they built with refuse on top of their old properties. Yeah. That's what you got in Honduras. In El Salvador, you have high rates of extortion and other criminal threats. It's got the highest crime rates in the world, essentially, in El Salvador. Mm-hmm. So, and then on top of that, in all three areas, you've got women facing domestic violence, record levels of domestic violence. So they're your issues. Okay. So what are they trying to do? You've got, essentially they are trying to, where are we? Sorry, I'm racing around here all over the place here. I can't find it. Look, essentially they're trying to increase funding in those regions to try and improve the areas so that
people don't come.
Yeah, so people don't come. That's the idea. The problem, of course, is that when you got a screwed up area and you give them money, usually you're giving them money to allow them to afford to come. That they can then use with people smugglers if they want to get out of there, unless you make the place a lot better, which is hard to do. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so that's what they're trying to do. We'll see how that goes. And the other thing they're trying to do, I'm just really wrapping this up quickly now because I can see you falling asleep. I can only imagine what our listeners are doing. The big thing that Biden's actually doing, which hasn't been talked about at all, is legal migration. Trump and Stephen Miller in particular went out of their way to make every single form of legal immigration fucked up. They tried to make every form impossible to sign, to fill out. They had this policy that if you had too many spaces, you didn't qualify. If you put an apostrophe in the wrong place, if you put a dot after the initial in your middle name, like that kind of stuff, all these ticky touchwood shit, which makes no difference whatsoever. They did it on purpose to try and exclude as many people as possible. All the waiting times blew out for every single kind of visa to the point where where Indian spouses, like this is because the Indian spouses is a real issue. I've forgotten what the visa's called, but it's like H4 or something, where when say Silicon Valley gets Indians out, because it's usually Indians for Silicon Valley, their spouses have to get visas as well before they can work. Some of them are waiting 20 years to get permission to work. It's just ridiculous. Like it's just ridiculous waiting periods for legal migration, right? Yeah. And they went out of their way, Stephen Miller in particular, went out of their way to make them worse because they're trying to they wanted to gut migration. Congress wouldn't let them. Yeah. So they'll try and do it through bureaucracy. Yeah. Biden wants to go through and change every single one of them and make it as easy as possible for people to legally migrate. Yeah. Stephen Miller had a cow about this on Twitter, and I loved it because he got like 8 likes. That's where he should be. He should be on Twitter having a cow and getting 8 likes. But that's what Biden actually wants to do. When people talk about what Biden wants to do with migration, that's what he wants to do. He wants to allow them to legally come and
properly administer it.
Yeah, and do it in a proper way. That is enough of me talking about migration. Do you have anything else to say about immigration? And then go for anything else you want to talk about.
No, great overview. I mean, the thing that I've been trying to do since the end of Donald Trump's time in power is understand the US-China relationship better, understand the Australian-China relationship better. I think some of us, it's been able to, whose main job is to look at the United States, we've had that moment that our attention can go elsewhere and, the world won't sort of disappear overnight. There's a degree of safety with Biden, and also, as you say, that demanding, rattling baby of Trump has gone, that we have been able to focus elsewhere. So I've spent a lot of time listening to China podcasts. I haven't found one like PEP that goes this deep or this long, but there's some great ones out there like the Little Red podcast and Pekingology, and there's a Australia in the World podcast, which talks a lot about China. And I suppose bringing it back to the United States, and something Biden's been talking about in recent times has been, what are the origins of COVID? Does it come out of this wet market in Wuhan, or is it possibly just a mistake, not a deliberate sort of thing that comes out of this virology lab in Wuhan? And I started following that when I was teaching American politics and foreign policy around the middle of last year, because this Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has a scholar that I've followed for a while there, Milton Littenberg, who I've been interested in his writings about germ warfare, in fact, in the Korean War, where there are a lot of claims that Americans dropped bugs on the North Koreans, which largely people think is baseless, but it was a big story in the Korean War. He wrote a report in the middle of last year saying it's possible that it could have come out of Wuhan. It isn't, it's not definite, but it's definitely a possibility, and this has been revisited. For a time, that was an argument that was in the realm of conspiracy theory, and I suppose some would have jumped on it as being a kind of racist sort of view about the Chinese and their labs. But I think as you're doing, with your podcast, being forensic and critical and being into the details, you've got to do that with every country. No country gets a pass on that. And I think this will be an issue that's alive for quite a long time, because there will be a sense of, how did this terrible virus get out? I think that's a legitimate and important question. And it's interesting that the Biden administration have wanted to revisit it. And it's made me think, well, why were the Australians calling for this inquiry alone? That wasn't, I don't think, a great policy. But why were they jumped on so hard? What was the concern that the Chinese had about an inquiry into this taking off? Obviously, the World Health Organization would have to be centrally involved. No government's going to go there and investigate. But this does seem one of those legitimate questions to be asked, rather than, obviously a lot of what Trump was saying about the Wuhan virus was plain xenophobia, and it was rightly criticized. But I think the origins of the virus, this virology lab, that I don't think that's the story of conspiracy theorists. I think there's something to be investigated there.
Well, certainly, yeah. You're saying that it was the realm of conspiracy theory last year, but I actually thought, like, I follow a lot of scientists because I'm into science, and at the time, I remember there were there were few real scientists who were saying there is no chance it was from the Wuhan lab. There were plenty of scientists who were saying my guess is it wasn't from the Wuhan lab. But there were very few people who weren't associated with the Wuhan lab who didn't say there's no chance of it not being from the Wuhan lab. It was journalists who said there is no chance, because at that point in time journalists were obsessed with following the science because they were trying to be good, and so they were taking their signals from scientists saying, yeah, I don't think it was from the lab, and then they ran with it and went way too far, and then they basically acted like boffer boys, just enforcing this inverted commas consensus, when the actual scientists were saying, well, no, there's a chance.
Yeah.
And so I think there's been a necessary adjustment since then for whatever reason. I guess it's because we just can't find the animal that it supposedly came from.
Yeah.
If it wasn't from the lab.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that what has emerged over the last little while is lies, like increasing amount. I was once again trying to race to get the actual details here, but I was just reading something just in Vanity Fair. I'll put it in the homework. There's a piece in Vanity Fair about some of the stuff going on during this process of the investigation into Wuhan lab, which was obviously extremely dodgy when China was running it. And some of the people there were just caught out in outright lies, like saying, for instance, when asked if they could, I've forgotten exactly what they were looking for. I think it was samples maybe of the compounds that they were studying, or maybe some results. And they were saying, and they were supposed to be online. And they say, oh, we took it off online. We took it offline during the COVID period because we were trying to stop hacking. But someone found out, no, they took it down in September 2019. They're lying. Why did they take it down in September 2019? We can't get any information about these 3 scientists that supposedly got sick with flu-like symptoms in November 2019.
Yep.
Why aren't we finding that information? Now, I am not of the view that necessarily came from the lab, but I am of the view that there is a shitload of lying going on, and it makes it very, very difficult to trust anyone in this scenario, especially the Chinese, the Chinese government and the people involved in this lab. So it makes it, it raises questions. Whatever,
and what do you think the Biden administration's play on this is? I mean, what is their interest in kind of litigating these issues or coming back to these issues?
My view is that they're following, that they're not leading anything. They're following.
They're following the news cycle.
They're following the news cycle. I think the most important thing that's happened is that a couple of liberals, a couple of respected liberals, have joined the lab crew. That's what's happened. Like people like Nicholas Wade, and who wrote a humdinger of a piece about this a couple of weeks ago, and people like what's his name in the Times, Nicholas
Christoph.
Yeah, Nicholas Christoph is another one as well. I don't think he's fully in the lab crew, but he's pretty close. And people like that, I think that the fact that they started asking questions, the Biden administration listens to them.
Yeah.
And it's I could do a whole rave on this. It's quite funny. During the COVID period, over and over again, the narrative hasn't come from the CDC. It's come from Nicholas Christoph in particular and the liberal commentariat. The CDC has been following them. Yeah. Like when the CDC do some stupid restriction that makes no sense, Nicholas Christoph writes, why did they do that for? And he brings the numbers. And then 2 days later, the CDC changes their mind. It's actually a little bit disheartening to see just how political they are in that respect. And how easily bullied they are. Like if they've got the science on their side, stand your ground. Yeah. But anyway, that's what I think's going on. I think that I think Biden is extremend susceptible to criticism. Yeah. Like I think he doesn't like criticism at all, especially from his people. Yeah. And I think that they're responding to that. And I think it's interesting that they closed down the State Department investigation back in February, and then they supposedly opened this intelligence agency's investigation that no one heard anything about until it became a news topic, and then all of a sudden everyone heard about it. Yep. I'm a bit sus about that. I think that maybe it might have been a bit of gilding the lily on that one. But anyway, I don't want to get all conspiracy theorist, but I do feel like that Biden is very responsive to the press.
Yeah.
That's all. Do you have any other thoughts about that kind of thing?
No. I think we've given them given people a lot of information.
Pretty good
Yeah,
value. They sometimes complain that the podcast is too short. I don't think they'll be complaining today.
Short for a drive to Brisbane.
Anyway, Brendon, thank you so much for your time.
No,
I
my
really,
pleasure.
really appreciate it. You're fantastic as always. How do people reach you? Don't give them a phone number.
I work at the University of Sydney. I am on Twitter. Haven't been very engaged since the election last year, but I am planning to get back on it. So Brendon O'Connor 9. So a B and a 9 at the end that sort of reverse each other.
I see. Are there 8 other B O'Connors? Have you checked?
No, it just looked good.
Fair enough. Thank you so much, guys. I'll see you next week. I hope you enjoyed this one. See you later.
See ya.